Welcome, friends, to another bedtime journey. Tonight, we'll drift together into the story of Xenogears, a tale of destiny, love, and courage that spans centuries. As you listen, let your mind grow calm and your body grow heavy, as though the weight of the day is slowly lifting away. If you enjoy these quiet retellings, remember to gently tap the like button. Share this story with someone who may also need rest. And subscribe so you can return for more dreamlike adventures. Now, close your eyes and let the story carry you into sleep. Long ago, before the world as we know it, a massive ship called the Eldridge drifted quietly through the stars. It was no ordinary vessel. It carried with it the most advanced technology of its time, and a secret that even its passengers barely understood. But one day, something within the ship awoke. A weapon, so powerful and so strange that even the scientists who created it lost control. Sirens filled the halls. Lights flashed red, and the once proud Eldridge fell into chaos. The weapon, known only as Deus, broke free of its chains and bent the entire ship to its will. Its power was overwhelming, and in that moment, the ship became little more than a prison, collapsing in on itself. The captain, realizing the danger, made a final, desperate choice. With a trembling hand, he ordered the ship to self-destruct, hoping to stop the weapon before it could consume everything. In a blinding light, the Eldridge exploded above an uncharted planet. Pieces of the great ship rained down from the sky like falling stars. What was once humanity's pride was reduced to scattered fragments, ruins of technology that would one day become the foundation of civilizations, myths, and legends on this new world. Yet, from the wreckage of the catastrophe, something stirred. Deus was not gone. Buried deep within the planet, it lingered, waiting for the day it would awaken again. And from the chaos of that destruction, the cycle of fate began to turn. A cycle that would stretch across thousands of years. This is where the story of Xenogears truly begins. Not with peace, but with the ruins of a fallen ship and the seeds of a destiny that no one could escape. Many centuries passed after the fall of the Eldridge. The scars of that ancient disaster faded into legend, and people built new lives on the planet's surface. It is here, in a small and quiet mountain village called Lahan, that we meet a young man named Fei Fong Wong. Fei has lived in this village for as long as he can remember. But his past is a mystery, even to himself. He cannot recall how he arrived in Lahan, nor can he remember much about his childhood. The villagers welcomed him warmly, and he grew into their community with kindness and gratitude. Though his hands were skilled with a brush, and he spent hours painting delicate scenes, Fei often carried a sense of something hidden deep inside him, like a shadow waiting to emerge. Lahan itself was a peaceful place, untouched by the wars that ravaged the wider world. Children played in the fields, families gathered at night, to share meals, and the people took comfort in their small routines. For Fei, this quiet life was enough. He enjoyed the warmth of friendship, the comfort of familiar faces, and the joy of simple days. Yet sometimes, when he closed his eyes, strange dreams would come. Dreams of machines, towering like giants, of battles, shaking the earth, and of sorrow, too heavy to name. The villagers noticed Fei's talent and his gentle heart. To them, he was one of their own, even if his origins were unclear. But beneath the surface of this tranquil life, the world beyond was stirring. Two great nations, Ava and Kislev, had been locked in endless war. Their battles fought with enormous machines, known as gears. Neither side would rest, and both sought dominance. And though Lahan was far from the front lines, fate has a way of finding those who try to hide from it. Soon, the sound of war would reach Fei's village, and the young man who wanted only peace would be forced to face a destiny larger than anything he could imagine. The world outside Lahan did not stay distant for long. One warm evening, as the villagers prepared for a wedding celebration, a shadow fell over the mountains. In the skies above, the thunder of engines roared, and then came the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal. Two giant gears, war machines, piloted by soldiers of the warring nations, descended upon the valley, clashing with a ferocity that shook the earth. The villagers scattered in fear, and Fei watched helplessly as the peaceful home he had known was pulled into a conflict not its own. The battle spiraled out of control, and Lahan was caught in its path. Explosions erupted in the fields, homes splintered, and cries of terror echoed across the night. Among the chaos stood an abandoned gear, black and imposing, resting as if it had been waiting for someone. This was Weltall. Its cockpit flickered, its systems humming with power, and Fei felt an overwhelming pull toward it, as though something deep inside him recognized it. Though he had never piloted such a machine, desperation overcame fear. He climbed inside. The moment Fei's hands touched the controls, the gear responded, as if it were part of him. He moved clumsily at first, stumbling, like a newborn, but within seconds, his motions grew natural, almost instinctive. The villagers looked on, in awe, believing salvation had come. Yet, something darker stirred within Fei's heart. His breath grew heavy, his vision blurred, and an unknown force surged through him. Then, it happened. A terrible burst of energy ripped through Weltall. Fei lost control. The gear unleashed a violent attack that tore through friend and foe alike. In a flash, the village of Lahan was reduced to ruins. Houses crumbled, flames rose to the heavens, and the very people who had raised him, his friends, his neighbors, were gone. When the smoke cleared, Fei stumbled out of the gear, trembling, unable to comprehend what he had done. The villagers who survived could not bear to look at him. Their sorrow turned into fear, and fear into anger. In their eyes, Fei was no longer their friend, but the destroyer of their home. Haunted by guilt, crushed by the weight of their stares, Fei made a choice. He could no longer stay in Lahan. With nothing but regret in his heart, he turned his back on the ruins of his village and walked into the unknown. The path before him was uncertain, but one truth had already become clear. The peace he once knew was gone forever. With the ruins of Lahan still smoldering behind him, Fei wandered into the wilderness. His footsteps felt heavy, not just from exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of guilt. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of those he had lost, the burning homes and the destruction his own hands had caused while inside the gear. He told himself he had no right to return, no right to call Lahan home ever again. Yet even as he tried to flee from his past, he was not alone. Citan Uzuki, the village doctor, and one of the few who had always seemed to understand Fei, followed after him. Calm, patient, and wise beyond measure, Citan had long suspected there was more to Fei than met the eye. He spoke gently, offering guidance without judgment, reminding Fei that running away would not erase what had happened, but that perhaps there was still a way forward. As they traveled, they encountered signs of a world tearing itself apart. Battles between Ava and Kislev spilled across the land, and refugees wandered the roads, caught in the crossfire. Fei tried to keep his head down, but the image of Weltall and the destruction he had caused clung to him like a shadow. It was during this time that fate brought him into contact with a young woman who would change his life forever. Elhaim van Houten, known simply as Elly. A soldier from Solaris, she was skilled, composed, and carried herself with the discipline of someone raised to follow orders. Yet beneath her uniform was a heart that struggled with doubt and compassion. Elly and Fei crossed paths under tense circumstances, their meeting tangled with battle. At first, they stood on opposite sides, unsure whether to see each other as enemies or allies. But in those fleeting moments, something stirred, an unspoken recognition, a connection neither could explain. Their eyes lingered on one another, just a moment too long, as if they had met before, somewhere beyond memory. Though Fei tried to bury his past in silence, both Citan and Elly could see there was more to him than he understood himself. Slowly, step by step, he was being drawn deeper into the storm that engulfed the world. And with each passing day, the question pressed harder. Was he merely a victim of fate? Or was he something far more important? Someone whose very existence could change the future? Fei's journey with Citan soon led them into lands scarred by the endless war between Ava and Kislev. The two nations had been locked in conflict for so long that no one could even remember how it truly began. Villages were burned, fields were left barren, and everywhere ordinary people suffered while rulers schemed behind castle walls. Though Fei longed to stay far from these battles, destiny kept pulling him closer. After several close encounters, Fei was eventually captured by the forces of Kislev. They did not see him as an ordinary wanderer, but as a dangerous pilot. one whose abilities in a gear could not be ignored. Stripped of his freedom, Fei was thrown into a dark cell within the capital city of Nortune, the very heart of Kislev. The city was vast and grim, built of stone and steel, its people hardened by years of war. Life here was harsh, ruled by survival and spectacle. In this place, Fei's skills as a pilot and as a fighter made him valuable, not as a soldier, but as entertainment. Kislev was infamous for its battle arena, a grand coliseum where men and machines clashed for the amusement of the crowd. The screams of thousands filled the air as prisoners and gladiators were forced to fight for survival, their victories rewarded with scraps of freedom, their defeats ending in silence. Fei, against his will, was pushed into this brutal world. It was here that he encountered Rico Banderas, the reigning champion of the arena. Rico was no ordinary man. He was a demi-human, towering and powerful, with green skin and beast-like features. To the people of Kislev, he was both feared and admired, a symbol of strength, but also a reminder of the discrimination demi-humans endured. Despite his fame, Rico carried a heavy bitterness, hardened by years of prejudice and the lonely path of a fighter. When Fei first stood before him, the crowd roared, eager to see the newcomer, crushed. Yet, something unexpected happened. Despite his inexperience, Fei held his own. His instincts in combat, sharpened by forces he himself barely understood, made him a formidable opponent. Though he struggled against Rico's raw power, there was a spark in Fei that intrigued even the champion. Instead of dismissing him as just another prisoner, Rico watched him carefully, sensing that this quiet outsider carried something dangerous, something extraordinary. The battles continued, day after day. Fei fought, not out of ambition, but to survive, to endure the nightmare of being trapped in a place where bloodshed was treated as spectacle. Slowly, he began to gain the respect of both the audience and his fellow prisoners. Even Rico, who at first looked down on him, began to acknowledge Fei as more than just another challenger. But with each victory, Fei felt the shadow within him grow stronger. Sometimes in the heat of combat, his mind would slip, his control wavering, as if another presence lurked inside him, eager to break free. He fought desperately to bury it, terrified of what might happen if he lost control again, as he had in Lahan. Within the walls of Nortune, Fei's world grew darker and more complex. Friendships were forged in chains, rivalries tested his will, and whispers of Solaris suggested that his capture was no coincidence. Even here, deep within Kislev, greater powers were moving their pieces. Fei could feel it. His story was far from over. Life in Nortune opened Fei's eyes to the broader suffering of the world. Every day, as he walked the gray corridors of the prison, or stood beneath the roar of the arena, he heard the same word whispered in fear: Solaris. Few understood what they truly were, but everyone knew the name, spoken quietly, like a curse, like a shadow hanging over the earth. Solaris was not just another kingdom, it was an empire, hidden in the skies above, unseen, unreachable, ruling from the clouds. To the people of the surface, the lambs, as Solaris scornfully called them, it was little more than a myth. But to Fei, Citan, and Elly, the truth was becoming clear. Solaris thrived on manipulation. They bent nations to their will. They fed wars like firewood, just to keep their vast machine turning. At its head was Emperor Cain, a figure shrouded in both reverence and fear. He was ancient, older than anyone believed possible. And though he carried the weight of authority, his presence felt more like a tired ghost than a ruler. Around him hovered the Gazelle Ministry, a council of disembodied digital minds, men who had given up their bodies long ago in a bid for immortality. They watched over the world from their fortress, moving pieces on a board, pushing kings and soldiers into battles that served a hidden design. And that design, unknown to most, was the resurrection of Deus, the godlike weapon that had destroyed the Eldritch. Solaris existed for that purpose alone. Every war, every manipulation, every sacrifice, tied to the day it would awaken once more. Fei did not yet know the full truth, but he could feel it pressing against him, heavy and cold. In every village destroyed, every soldier lost in battle, there was a pattern too cruel to be coincidence. It was as though humanity itself was caught in invisible chains, repeating cycles of destruction with no end. In the midst of this, Elly's presence grew more important. Though she was a Solaris officer, her heart was never fully theirs. She struggled with the loyalty she had been trained to uphold, and the compassion that tugged at her whenever she looked at Fei. Their conversations, sometimes quiet and hesitant, revealed pieces of herself she had never shared with anyone. She spoke of her doubts, of the cruelty of the system she served, and of her fear that she would never escape the life chosen for her. For Fei, Elly became both a mirror and a guide. She reminded him of what he wanted to protect, even as guilt still gnawed at him. And though neither of them could explain why, there was a feeling between them, a connection that felt older than the war, older than Solaris, perhaps older than the world itself. Citan, ever watchful, noticed this bond. Though his words were calm and measured, there was a knowing weight in his eyes. He guided Fei gently, but he also urged caution. He reminded Fei that Solaris was not merely an enemy on the battlefield. It was a force that shaped destiny itself. If Fei and Elly were to stand against it, they would need strength not just of body, but of heart and spirit. And so, as Fei's time in Kislev reached its turning point, the threads of the story began to intertwine. A hidden empire, controlling the fates of millions, a mysterious emperor, weary of his own existence, and two young souls, Fei and Elly, drawn together, unaware that their bond was the key to unlocking a cycle that stretched back thousands of years. The days in Nortun's prison passed like a blur of steel and stone. Every morning, the guards dragged Fei and the other captives into the Colosseum, where the roar of the crowd washed over them like thunder. The arena was enormous, a monument to Kislev's obsession with blood sport. Its walls were decorated with banners, its seats packed with citizens hungry for spectacle. And at its center stood the sands where men and machines were forced to fight, until one no longer stood. For Fei, each match was a test of survival. His opponents were often larger, stronger, and more experienced. Yet something inside him always seemed to awaken when danger pressed close. His movements in combat flowed with an instinct he didn't understand, as though his body remembered techniques that his mind had long forgotten. With every battle, he drew attention, not only from the audience, but from the reigning champion of the arena, Rico Banderas. Rico was unlike any other fighter. A demi-human, towering in size, with emerald green skin and horns jutting from his brow. He had ruled the arena for years. His strength was legendary, his presence commanding, and his victories nearly uncountable. The people of Nortune both feared him and celebrated him. Though to the higher powers of Kislev, he was still little more than a beast. To Rico, the arena was a cage. He fought because that was the role forced upon him, and he wore his victories like chains rather than crowns. When Rico first saw Fei fight, he was unimpressed. To him, Fei looked soft, an outsider thrown into battles he could not possibly survive. But as the matches continued, Rico's attitude began to change. Fei's resilience was uncanny. He was knocked down, yet rose again. He was pushed to his limits, yet always found some reserve of strength, some hidden fire to keep going. Even in defeat, Fei's spirit burned with a quiet determination that even Rico, hardened by years of prejudice and loneliness, could not ignore. The two men's paths crossed directly in the arena. At last, the crowd trembled with anticipation, knowing they were about to witness the champion against the rising challenger. Rico stood like a wall of muscle and power, while Fei, smaller and seemingly fragile, faced him with calm eyes and clenched fists. Their first clash sent a shockwave through the arena. Rico's blows were devastating, shaking the very ground. But Fei's movements carried a strange precision, as if guided by something beyond him. As the battle raged, something darker began to stir in Fei. Each strike he threw seemed to draw him deeper into a place he did not want to go, a place where rage and destruction whispered to him. He fought not only against Rico, but against himself, against the shadow of that other presence inside him, the one that had leveled Lahan. At moments, it felt as though his hands were no longer his own, his body moving with terrifying force. The fight ended not with Fei's victory, or Rico's, but with a draw that left both men standing in the ring, exhausted, breathing hard, and staring at one another with newfound respect. For Rico, this outsider had proven himself more than another disposable fighter. For Fei, Rico was no longer just an obstacle, but a reflection of his own struggle, a man defined by others, trapped by circumstance, and yet still carrying pride in who he was. Outside the arena, their bond slowly grew. Rico's gruff demeanor hid a sharp mind and a wounded heart. And though he rarely spoke of it, Fei could sense the pain behind his strength. The two men, so different on the surface, found themselves connected by the invisible weight of expectations they had never asked to bear. But Fei's strange outbursts in battle did not go unnoticed. Whispers spread among the guards, and the crowd, murmurs that this quiet young man might not be human at all, or that something monstrous slept inside him. And Fei himself knew. The whispers were not wrong. Every victory seemed to draw him closer to losing control, to becoming that destructive force once again. As the arena cheered his name, and Rico began to see him as an equal, Fei felt only unease. He could not escape the sense that all of this, the battles, the victories, even his meeting with Rico, was part of a larger path, being shaped by unseen hands. And somewhere beyond the prison walls, Solaris continued to watch, waiting for the moment to pull its strings tighter. The days in Nortune blurred together, each one marked by new battles and the echo of the crowd. Yet, while the outside world saw Fei as a rising fighter, inside he was beginning to fracture. Each time he stepped into the arena, the weight of the cockpit or the pressure of combat seemed to stir something hidden deep in his mind. He could feel it waiting there, like a voice behind a locked door, whispering, pressing, begging to be let out. At first it was fleeting, a sharp pain in his temples, a flash of red in his vision, a memory that did not belong to him. But the more he fought, the more the barrier between himself and this presence began to weaken. Fei would strike harder than he meant to, his movements too fluid, too deadly for someone who had never trained as a soldier. It was as though another self guided his hands, a self who lived only for battle. One night, unable to rest, Fei sat in the silence of his cell. He closed his eyes and saw himself standing not in the prison, but in a strange, endless void. Before him, a figure appeared, familiar and yet terrifying. It looked like him, but the eyes were sharper, burning with violent energy. The figure smiled with cruel confidence, a smile that made Fei's heart race. "I am you," the figure said softly, though its voice carried like thunder in Fei's mind. "I am the part you deny, the part you bury." "I am," Fei recoiled. The name filled him with dread, even though he did not fully understand it. Id laughed, a low, unsettling sound. "You try to pretend you're gentle. You paint, you smile, you cling to peace. But when the world presses, when danger comes, you know who truly saves you. Not Fei, the weak dreamer. Me, Id." The vision ended abruptly, leaving Fei gasping for breath, sweat dripping from his brow. He gripped his head, terrified that he was losing himself. The fear of what he had done in Lahan surged back to him. Was it really him who destroyed the village? Or was it this Id, this other self who had taken control? And if so, how long before it happened again? Citan, though calm and composed as always, seemed to notice these changes in Fei. He would watch him carefully during battles, his sharp eyes narrowing whenever Fei's movements grew too precise, too violent. He did not say much, but there was a heaviness in his silence, as though he knew more than he allowed himself to reveal. Elly, too, began to sense it. Though she fought her own struggle, torn between her loyalty to Solaris and her compassion for the people she had come to know, she felt an inexplicable pull toward Fei. She saw the sorrow in his eyes, the guilt he carried, and the moments when his hands trembled as though fighting something unseen. She reached out to him with kindness, her words gentle, though she too feared what might be hidden beneath his surface. Meanwhile, Rico watched with a fighter's intuition. He respected Fei's spirit, but he knew the look of a man who held back more than he showed. In Fei's quiet gaze, he saw both fragility and danger. A storm barely restrained. As the battles grew fiercer, and the world outside Nortun's walls pressed closer, Fei's inner struggle became impossible to ignore. Id was no longer just a whisper. He was a presence, waiting for the right moment to seize control. And when that moment came, the line between savior and destroyer would vanish in an instant. Fei did not yet understand the truth, that Id was not merely a shadow, but a part of himself, born from trauma, from pain, from something ancient, and repeating across lifetimes. All he knew was that he was not alone in his own body, and that terrified him more than any enemy he could face in the arena. As Fei continued to wrestle with the shadow inside him, his path crossed more and more often with Elly. At first, their meetings had been brief, filled with hesitation and the unspoken tension of being on different sides of the world's endless conflict. She was an officer of Solaris, raised in its rigid order, trained to obey without question. He was an outcast now, hunted by circumstance, carrying guilt for Lahan and the burden of his hidden other self. Yet, despite these barriers, their connection deepened in ways neither could fully explain. Elly's presence was unlike anything Fei had known. She was strong, yet vulnerable, disciplined, yet filled with quiet doubts. In stolen conversations, she admitted things she had never dared voice aloud. That she hated the cruelty of Solaris, that she questioned the endless war, and that sometimes, in the silence of night, she wondered if her whole life had been built on lies. Fei listened, his heart heavy but also comforted. For the first time since the destruction of Lahan, he felt seen, not as a monster, not as a prisoner, but as a person. And Elly, for her part, was drawn to Fei in ways she couldn't understand. There was a familiarity in his eyes, a warmth that pulled at her, even when she tried to resist it. Sometimes, when their gazes met, her chest tightened with a strange ache, as if she were remembering something she had forgotten long ago. Their bond felt deeper than chance, deeper than mere attraction. It felt like destiny, weaving its threads between them. Citan, always watchful, noticed the closeness growing. Though his words remained measured, there was a quiet knowing in his eyes. He reminded Fei that Elly's loyalties were complicated, that she was still tied to Solaris by duty, and that trusting her completely might carry risks. Yet he did not discourage the bond. Instead, he seemed to observe it, as though it were part of a larger plan only he could see. Beyond them, Solaris's grip on the world became clearer. Fei and his companions learned more about how deeply the Empire manipulated everything, controlling governments, fueling wars, and using the people of the surface as tools for their greater purpose. Whole nations bent unknowingly to their will, and the common people suffered without ever realizing who held the chains. The cruelty of it burned in Fei's chest, especially when he looked at Elly and wondered how someone with her compassion could have been raised in such a system. The conflict within Elly mirrored Fei's own. He battled id, the violent presence within, while she battled the weight of her loyalty to Solaris against her growing love for the people she had once been taught to see as lesser. Their struggles were different, yet parallel, two lives bound together by forces greater than either could see. As the days passed, their moments together grew longer. A conversation under the stars, where Elly admitted her fear of what she might become if she continued to serve Solaris. A quiet walk after battle, where Fei confessed his shame over Lahan, and she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, reminding him that guilt alone could not define him. These small exchanges built a bond stronger than either expected. But even as they drew closer, danger crept in from all sides. Solaris was aware of Elly's wavering loyalty, and Fei's strange power had not gone unnoticed. The Empire's gaze was fixed firmly upon them both. The closer they came to one another, the more tightly the web of destiny closed around them. What neither of them knew was that their bond was not new. It was ancient, a cycle that had repeated across lifetimes, always pulling them together in love and in tragedy. Their souls were bound to the fate of the world, and as their hearts opened to one another, the path toward that truth drew ever nearer. Far above the world where Fei and Elly walked, hidden from the eyes of ordinary people, Solaris moved its pieces in silence. While villagers struggled to survive and soldiers bled on battlefields, the Empire's rulers watched from their towers, orchestrating everything with cold precision. To them, humanity was not free. It was a resource, a tool to be guided, harvested, and sacrificed. At the heart of Solaris rule sat the Gazelle Ministry. They were not men, at least not in the way most understood. Long ago, they had abandoned their flesh, choosing instead to live as disembodied digital minds, fragments of their former selves, preserved through ancient technology. They spoke in eerie unison, their voices echoing like hollow chants as they debated the fate of the world. In their eyes, people were nothing more than pawns, pieces to be discarded or used in their endless pursuit of one goal: the resurrection of Deus. Deus was more than a weapon. It was the God machine, the very entity that had destroyed the Eldridge millennia ago. When the ship fell, fragments of Deus scattered across the planet, burying themselves deep in the land, in the people, and in the flow of history itself. The Gazelle Ministry believed that humanity existed for a single purpose: to restore Deus to its full power. Every war, every sacrifice, every system they created served this plan. Over them loomed Emperor Cain. His presence was strange, commanding, yet weary. While the Gazelle spoke with zeal and hunger for resurrection, Cain's voice often trembled with fatigue, as though he bore the weight of centuries too heavy to endure. Few in Solaris dared question him, yet even fewer truly understood him. He was older than any living being, his lifespan stretching back to the days of the crash. And though he ruled, he was not free. Like the Gazelle, he was bound to Deus, a prisoner of the cycle that had defined human existence for thousands of years. Cain sometimes spoke of ending it, of breaking the chains that bound them all. But the Gazelle Ministry dismissed such thoughts, their obsession with reviving their god overriding any hint of doubt. To them, Deus was destiny. To Cain, it was a curse he could no longer bear. Fei, wandering the surface with Elly and Citan, knew none of this in full detail. But he felt it. In the ruins they passed, in the gears left behind from forgotten wars, in the whispers of people who suffered without knowing why, he felt the invisible hand of something immense pressing against his life. Each time he looked at Elly, that weight grew heavier. There was something about their bond that seemed to defy reason, something ancient and unspoken, tying them together. Elly too sensed it. In her dreams, she sometimes saw flashes of worlds not her own, scenes of herself and Fei standing together in different times, different places, always bound by love, always separated by tragedy. She did not understand them. But when she woke, her heart ached with a longing she could not explain. Citan, ever the careful observer, noticed the signs as well. His eyes lingered on Fei with quiet intensity, as though he were measuring not just the young man before him, but the countless echoes of lives that had come before. He offered no answers, only gentle guidance. But his silence carried secrets too vast to name. And so, as Fei struggled with the shadow of id within him, and as Elly questioned the loyalty she once held to Solaris, a larger truth loomed unseen. They were both pieces of a story that had begun thousands of years ago. A story tied to Deus, to Emperor Cain, to the Gazelle Ministry, and to the fate of the entire world. The cycle was moving again, and Fei stood at its center, whether he was ready or not. Far from the cold halls of Solaris, and away from the arena sands of Kislev, the winds of fate carried Fei into the path of someone entirely different. A young man who lived not in palaces or prisons, but on the open sea. His name was Bartholomew Fatima, though most called him simply Bart. He was the last heir to the throne of Ave, a kingdom torn apart by endless war and manipulation. Bart was unlike anyone Fei had met. With his golden hair wild in the desert sun and an eye patch covering one eye, he carried himself with reckless charm, his voice filled with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But beneath his bravado was a heart that burned fiercely for freedom and loyalty to those he loved. Though a prince by birth, Bart had long abandoned royal halls, choosing instead to fight as a pirate, living aboard a massive sand cruiser that roamed the deserts like a ship upon the sea. When Fei first encountered him, Bart's energy was overwhelming, boisterous, impulsive, and quick to draw his weapon. Yet his crew adored him, for he treated them as equals, bound not by bloodlines or duty, but by friendship and trust. Together, they struck back at the powers of Solaris and Ava's puppet rulers, stealing supplies, freeing captives, and fighting battles for those who could not protect themselves. Fei, still burdened by guilt and uncertain of his place in the world, was at first hesitant to join Bart's cause. Yet as he spent time aboard the sand cruiser, he saw something he had not known since before Lahan was destroyed. Camaraderie. The laughter of Bart's crew, the unity they shared in their struggles, reminded him of what it meant to fight, not for power, but for one another. Bart himself was quick to challenge Fei, not just in battle, but in spirit. He mocked Fei's quiet hesitations, pushing him to be bolder, while Fei, in turn, reminded Bart of the responsibility that came with his fiery passion. Their clashes were sharp, but beneath them grew the seeds of mutual respect. Bart could see that Fei was no ordinary drifter, and Fei began to realize that Bart's reckless energy hid a leader who carried the heavy weight of a broken kingdom on his shoulders. It was during their adventures together that Fei also saw more of the world Solaris had shaped. Villages starved, while puppet governments lined their pockets. Soldiers fought wars without understanding who truly commanded them. And always, from the shadows, Solaris's invisible hand pushed events toward deeper conflict. Bart's rebellion, small as it seemed against such a vast power, was one of the few sparks of resistance left. Together, Fei, Bart, Citan, and eventually Elly fought alongside one another, their battles stretching across deserts and fortresses, their gears clashing with enemies far stronger than themselves. Each victory was hard-earned, yet every step forward brought them closer as comrades. For Fei, it was the first time since leaving Lahan that he felt he was moving not only away from guilt, but toward something greater, a cause worth protecting. Still, even as bonds formed and victories were won, Fei could not escape the shadow inside him. In the heat of battle, he sometimes felt ID's presence pressing against the edges of his mind, waiting for the moment of weakness to take over. Citan noticed. Elly noticed, but neither abandoned him. And so, aboard Bart's great sand cruiser, under the endless skies of the desert, the unlikely group pressed onward. They were rebels, fugitives, wanderers, yet slowly becoming more. Without realizing it, they were forming the beginnings of something far greater than themselves, a force that could one day stand against the empire of Solaris itself. For so long, Solaris had been a shadow on the horizon, a name whispered in fear, a force felt but never seen. Its existence seemed almost mythical to the people of the surface, an empire in the skies, pulling strings no one could cut. But now, for Fei, Elly, Bart, and their companions, the time had come to see Solaris with their own eyes. Their infiltration began in secrecy, slipping past defenses that seemed more like walls of light than stone. Solaris was not a place like Nortune or Ave, carved from earth and stone. It was a floating city of dazzling technology, suspended high above the world, glittering with cold brilliance. Towers stretched into the sky like blades, streets glowed with artificial light, and machines hummed in every direction. At first glance, it appeared as a utopia, perfectly ordered, shining, almost divine. But beneath the surface, the truth was far darker. The people of Solaris were divided, not just by class, but by purpose. At the top stood the ruling elite, living lives of indulgence and comfort. Below them were soldiers, engineers, and citizens who served faithfully, believing themselves chosen. But beneath it all, hidden from the eyes of most, were the labor camps, where surface dwellers were dragged in chains, their identities erased, their bodies used as fuel for the empire. Fei and the others moved cautiously through this world of cruel perfection. They saw how Solaris viewed the people of the surface, not as fellow humans, but as lambs, livestock, expendable lives meant to be consumed in service of their greater purpose. Villages destroyed, wars prolonged, famine allowed to spread. It was all part of the design. Solaris fed upon suffering, and the people of the surface never even knew who held the knife. For Elly, the truth struck hardest. She had been raised to serve Solaris, to see it as the pinnacle of order and strength. But walking with Fei through the hidden depths, she saw what her empire truly was: a machine of cruelty. Her heart ached as she watched prisoners stripped of their names, their humanity crushed, their lives reduced to numbers in the system. More than once, she turned away in shame, tears catching in her eyes, unable to reconcile the world she had defended with the horrors before her. Citan, ever observant, spoke of what it all meant. Solaris's order, its hierarchy, its cruelty. None of it was random. It was all designed to serve a single purpose: the resurrection of Deus. Every resource, every life, every act of violence was another piece feeding the God machine buried deep within the planet. Humanity itself had been shaped as a tool for its return. As they moved deeper into Solaris, Fei's heart burned. He saw the prisoners, the lifeless eyes of those who had been used and discarded. And he thought of Lahan. The weight of his guilt grew heavier. But this time it carried something new: anger. Not the blind fury of id, but a fierce determination. He realized that the destruction of his village had not been fate or accident alone. It had been part of this system, a cycle meant to break lives, so the Empire could tighten its grip. Elly clung closer to Fei, torn apart by the knowledge that her own people had built this nightmare. Yet, in Fei's presence, she found a fragile strength. She whispered to him in the quiet moments, "I don't want to be part of this anymore. I don't want to be Solaris." Her voice trembled, but Fei held her hand, and in that small gesture, she felt a promise that together they could resist what seemed impossible to fight. Above them, the Gazelle ministry watched their movements with cold interest, speaking in their hollow voices about Fei, about the contact, about the importance of his existence. They saw him not as a man, but as a key. And Emperor Cain, weary and silent, listened in the shadows, his expression unreadable, as the cycle of destiny continued to turn. For Fei and his companions, the journey into Solaris was more than an infiltration. It was a revelation, a shattering of illusions. The enemy was not just another nation, not another general or king. The enemy was an empire that spanned centuries, an empire that sought to bend all life toward the resurrection of a machine god. And for the first time, Fei began to realize that he was not simply caught in its grasp. He was central to it. The deeper they ventured into Solaris, the heavier the air seemed to grow. Every hallway, every chamber, felt like it was watching them, as if the Empire itself was aware of their intrusion. Fei struggled to keep his focus, but with each step, the pressure inside him grew harder to contain. It was as though Solaris itself awakened something in him, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. It began quietly, a tremor in his hands, his breath coming shorter, flashes of red across his vision. His companions noticed Elly's worried glance, Citan's sharp calculating eyes, Bart's uneasy silence. But before anyone could speak, the pressure inside Fei broke free. In an instant, His demeanor shifted. His posture straightened. His eyes sharpened. And a cruel, confident smile curved across his face. The warmth that marked Fei's presence was gone, replaced by something colder, hungrier. This was not the gentle soul who had carried guilt since Lahan. This was Id. The change was terrifying. Where Fei hesitated in battle, Id thrived. Where Fei doubted, Id exuded certainty. He moved with effortless precision, his every strike deliberate and merciless. Piloting Weltall, he was unstoppable, striking down enemies with devastating force, carving through machines and soldiers alike, as though they were nothing but paper before a storm. The others watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the sheer violence he unleashed. Rico, who had once thought himself the strongest, could barely believe what he saw. Bart, who had never doubted his own courage, felt a knot of fear twist in his chest. Even Elly, who had sensed Fei's inner turmoil, recoiled at the sight of Id in full control. His voice, though it came from Fei's lips, was deeper, laced with venomous confidence. "You really thought Fei was the one protecting you?" Id sneered, his words like daggers. "He's weak, he hides. He clings to guilt like a child clings to a toy. I am the one who keeps him alive. I am the one who makes him strong." The truth cut deeper than any blade, for a part of it rang true. In every desperate moment, in every instant where Fei's life should have ended, it had been Id's power lurking beneath, ready to surface. The destruction of Lahan, the bursts of overwhelming strength in battle, all of it had been Id. Elly tried to reach him, calling out Fei's name, her voice trembling with desperation. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw his true self flicker in his eyes. But Ed laughed and turned away, refusing her plea. To him, compassion was weakness, and he had no patience for it. Citan, calm but firm, observed the transformation with grim resolve. Unlike the others, he did not react with shock. His silence suggested he had long suspected the truth, that Ed was real, that he was part of Fei. But even Citan could not disguise the weight of what stood before them. A force beyond control, a presence born from trauma and destruction, now walking openly among them. As Id tore through Solaris's forces, the others could do nothing but follow in his wake. They needed his power to survive, yet every display of it left them shaken. Id's existence was not just another secret. It was a storm within Fei's soul, one that threatened not only their mission, but the fragile bonds of trust holding the group together. When the battle ended, and Ed finally receded, Fei collapsed, his body trembling, his mind fractured by the weight of what had happened. He barely remembered the carnage, though the faces of his companions told him everything. They looked at him with fear, with doubt, with sorrow. And though Elly still reached for him, whispering his name with trembling hands, Fei turned his face away, ashamed, afraid of himself. For the first time, his companions realized that Fei was not only fighting Solaris, not only fighting the endless wars of the world. He was fighting himself. And Ed, the other self within him, was not going to remain in the shadows any longer. After Id's violent awakening, the group could no longer look at Fei the same way. Even when his softer self returned, tired, ashamed, eyes full of sorrow, the memory of Id's smirk, his effortless brutality, lingered in their minds like a shadow on the wall. It was as though two lives shared the same body, one desperate to protect, the other eager to destroy. Fei himself was shaken to his core. He awoke in the quiet of the ship, with no memory of how the battles had ended, only to see the faces of his companions turned toward him, some full of worry, others full of fear. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet their gaze, his chest tight with shame. Again and again he asked the same questions, whispering them as though afraid of the answers. What am I? Who am I really? Citan stayed near him, his calm presence a lifeline. Yet behind his soft-spoken reassurances, there was a depth to his silence. He seemed to know more about Fei than he revealed, his gaze steady and thoughtful whenever Fei trembled with confusion. There are parts of yourself you cannot yet face, he told him gently. But running from them will only make them stronger. In time, Fei, you must confront what lies within you. But time was what Fei feared he did not have. Ed was not a distant nightmare anymore. He was here, waiting, ready to seize control the moment Fei faltered. And though Fei's hands had painted pictures of peace, Id's hands were painted with blood. The contrast tore at him, pulling his spirit in opposite directions. It was Elly who stayed closest. Despite the fear she had felt watching Id's wrath, she could not abandon Fei. She saw the trembling in his shoulders when he thought no one was looking, the way he pressed his palms to his temples, as if trying to keep his skull from splitting apart. She would sit beside him quietly, sometimes speaking, sometimes only letting her presence say what words could not. That she believed in him, even when he did not believe in himself. And Fei, though he struggled to accept it, felt her presence as a small light in the darkness. With her, the burden was easier to carry, if only for a moment. Still, the bond between them frightened him. If Ed emerged again, would Elly be caught in his destruction, just as the people of Lahan had been? That fear made Fei hesitate, drawing close to her yet pulling away, caught between love and the terror of harming what he cherished most. As they continued their journey, fragments of memory began to stir. Strange images flashed in Fei's dreams. Memories of a child's voice crying out, of hands covered in red, of a cold laboratory bathed in harsh white light. He saw himself, but not as he was now. Smaller, broken, full of rage. He awoke each time drenched in sweat, the name Id echoing in his ears like a curse. Citan and Elly knew these memories were the key, but neither pushed him to face them before he was ready. Instead, they stood beside him as anchors, holding him steady as he drifted through storms within himself. But Fei also began to understand something frightening. Id was not just an invader inside him. It was him, born from trauma and pain. A part of his soul fractured and left to grow wild. He was the embodiment of rage Fei had buried, the survivor who had risen when the boy could not. To destroy Id would mean destroying part of himself. To accept Id would mean risking the loss of everything he held dear. This was Fei's true battlefield, not the Colosseum of Nortune, not the shining towers of Solaris, but the war within his own heart. And though his companions could stand at his side, only Fei could face the truth of who he really was. While Fei battled the storms within himself, another presence lingered silently in the shadows, moving like a thread through history itself. Her name was Miang, though that name was only one of many. To the world, she appeared as an ordinary woman, sometimes a nurse, sometimes a soldier, sometimes a leader. But in truth, she was far more. Miang was not bound to a single body, nor to a single life. When one vessel perished, her essence would awaken in another, again and again through the centuries. She had lived countless lives, always carrying the same purpose, always guided by the same unseen master. To her, death was little more than a doorway, and every woman who unknowingly bore her essence became part of the cycle. Her role was simple, yet devastating. She was the caretaker of Deus, the hidden hand that shaped humanity in preparation for its resurrection. Whenever history threatened to stray too far from the path, Miang would appear, gentle when persuasion was enough, ruthless when destruction was required. Wars, betrayals, revolutions. Behind so many of them, Miang's presence could be felt. The people who met her never realized the truth. They thought her merely a brilliant strategist, a loyal servant, or a compassionate guide. Yet always, her loyalty lay not with humanity, but with the god machine buried beneath the earth. Miang's voice was the whisper in the ears of kings, the silent push that drove empires toward ruin, the architect of events that served no one but Deus. For Fei and his companions, her existence was still a mystery, but her influence was already entangling them. In Solaris, soldiers obeyed her commands without question. Leaders deferred to her judgment, even when it meant cruelty. And Elly, who had been raised within that same system, sometimes felt an uneasy shiver when she heard Miang's name, as though her very spirit recoiled at something it could not explain. What made Miang most dangerous was her patience. She never needed to hurry, never needed to reveal her hand. She knew that time was always on her side, because she was time, woven into the very fabric of humanity's existence. From the fall of the Eldridge to the present moment, she had walked silently through history, her eyes fixed always on the same end: the complete revival of Deus. Their bond, their struggles, even Fei's fractured soul, everything was a thread she intended to weave into the tapestry of resurrection. In her endless cycle, she had guided humanity toward this moment for millennia. And now, as fate drew closer to its climax, she would step fully onto the stage. For where Fei represented the contact, and Elly the antitype, Miang was the hand of the system itself. A reminder that destiny was not only about love or struggle, but about manipulation, chains, and the weight of a god machine waiting patiently beneath the soil. As Fei wrestled with id, and Elly struggled with her loyalty to Solaris, a deeper truth lay hidden just beneath the surface of their lives. It was not only circumstance that had drawn them together, nor simple chance that made their hearts lean toward one another. Their bond stretched across centuries, woven into the very fabric of history. Long ago, when the Eldridge fell, and humanity was scattered across the new world, two souls were bound by fate, the contact and the antitype. Fei and Elly were their latest forms. But theirs was not the first story. Again and again, across lifetimes, these two had found each other, sometimes as lovers, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as strangers meeting in fleeting moments, and yet always, their union carried the same weight: hope, love, and tragedy intertwined. In distant memories, buried deep within Fei's soul, there lingered fragments of these lives. A warrior standing beside a woman in a crumbling city, promising to fight until the very end. A farmer's son and a noble's daughter, their love forbidden, destroyed by the cruelty of war. A healer and a wanderer, torn apart by forces beyond their control. Each life a different story, yet each ending the same. They were always separated, always broken, always denied the peace they longed for. Elly too felt these echoes. In dreams, she sometimes saw herself wearing clothes she had never owned, speaking words she had never learned, her hands reaching for Fei's, across flames, across battlefields, across the silence of death. She would wake with tears in her eyes, unable to explain the aching in her chest, the certainty that she had lost him before, countless times. The cycle was not merely chance. It was part of the great system that bound humanity to Deus. Each reincarnation of Fei as the contact, and Elly as the antitype, was pulled back into the struggle, their love both a weapon and a wound. Together, they had the power to resist the God machine. Yet that same bond also made them its greatest threat. And so fate ensured they were never allowed to remain together in peace. Citan, who had long studied the mysteries of their world, recognized the signs. Though he rarely spoke of it outright, his eyes often softened when he looked upon them. He knew their bond was not new, but ancient, a thread stretching back to the dawn of this broken cycle. And he knew, too, that until the truth was faced, they would be caught again, in the tragedy of endless repetition. For Fei and Elly, the realization began slowly. At first, it was only the unspoken familiarity in their glances, the way their souls seemed to recognize one another before their minds could. Then came the dreams, the visions, the moments when words spoken centuries ago seemed to rise from their lips without effort. And with each revelation, the bond between them grew stronger, both a comfort and a burden. They did not yet fully understand that they had always been together, across lifetimes, across deaths, always returning to one another, only to be torn apart. But they felt it, deep within. Their love was eternal, and yet it had never once been allowed to endure. And now, in this life, as Solaris closed its grip, and Deus stirred beneath the earth, the cycle was moving again. Would they finally break free from it? Or would history repeat itself, dragging them once more into sorrow? The answer lay ahead, waiting in the battles still to come. For all the wars, and all the suffering that scarred the surface world, for all the cruelty that Solaris inflicted upon its lambs, there was a deeper, darker truth that lay buried beneath it all. The empires, the rulers, the endless cycles of death and control. These were not the root of the problem. They were branches, growing from a single ancient seed. That seed was Deus. Deus was not a god, though to humanity it seemed divine. It was the planetary weapon system aboard the Eldridge, a creation of terrible power, meant to wage wars beyond imagination. When the ship fell from the stars, Deus was shattered, its body torn apart, its fragments scattered across the world. But its essence survived, slumbering deep within the planet, waiting patiently to be restored. It could not rebuild itself alone. For that, it needed humanity, not as soldiers or servants, but as raw material. Every system Solaris created, the wars between nations, the endless suffering of the surface people, the cold hierarchy that placed the elite above all others, was designed for a single purpose: to prepare the world for Deus's resurrection. Human lives were fuel. Their suffering was part of the system. Even their very evolution was shaped to serve the machine. The Gazelle Ministry, those hollow voices preserved in data, spoke of it with reverence. To them, Deus was destiny itself, a god machine whose revival would fulfill the purpose of their existence. They manipulated every nation, every war, every moment of history to feed into this plan. To the Gazelle, free will was an illusion. There was only the cycle of preparation, sacrifice, and return. And yet, not all within Solaris embraced this vision with the same zeal. Emperor Cain, weary and burdened, saw Deus for what it truly was: a curse upon humanity, a chain that bound every man, woman, and child to endless servitude. His eyes, ancient and sorrowful, carried the weight of centuries, of watching the same cycle repeat. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was often with a tone of resignation, as though he longed for an end, not just for himself, but for the entire system. Liang, however, was different. She served not with hesitation, but with absolute loyalty. As the caretaker of Deus, her existence was tied directly to the god machine's survival. She was the hand that shaped history, to ensure that humanity never strayed too far, that they always remained bound to their fate. Her presence was the system's guarantee, reincarnating endlessly to keep the resurrection on course. For Fei and his companions, these revelations struck like lightning. The wars between Ave and Kislev, the battles that had taken so many lives, the villages destroyed, the people enslaved, all of it was meaningless in itself. All of it had been orchestrated, every step a cog in the vast machinery of Deus. Fei's heart burned with rage and sorrow as he began to grasp the truth. The destruction of Lahan was not an accident of war. It was part of this design. The invisible hand of Deus reaching out, through Solaris's manipulation, Humanity's pain was not random. It was cultivated, harvested, and consumed. Elly, too, felt the weight of this knowledge. Her loyalty to Solaris, already shaken, shattered completely. To learn that her people had not only served cruelty, but had been built from the beginning as tools for a machine, made her tremble with grief. She wept in silence, clutching at her chest, whispering, "What are we, if this is all we were made for?" But in the silence after the revelation, Citan spoke gently, reminding them that knowledge itself was power. If the purpose of humanity is to serve Deus, then perhaps the truest act of freedom, he said softly, is to break the cycle. For Fei, these words sparked a fragile hope. His guilt and his fear of id still weighed heavily on him. But in this moment, he saw a path forward, not only for himself, but for the entire world. If Deus was the cycle's heart, then destroying it might be the only way to free humanity. And yet, even as he resolved to resist, he knew the truth. Solaris, Miang, the Gazelle Ministry, they would stop at nothing to see their god reborn. And deep inside him, Ed stirred restlessly, drawn to the chaos, as though he too was bound to Deus, in ways Fei could not yet understand. The path ahead was clear, but it was not simple. To fight Deus was to fight destiny itself. As Fei and his companions pressed forward, the hidden rulers of Solaris continued their schemes. The Gazelle Ministry, their voices hollow, mechanical, spoke in endless circles of prophecy and resurrection. They had lived as data for centuries, stripped of flesh, yet clinging to the illusion of immortality. To them, humanity's purpose was clear. Every war, every sacrifice, every death was one step closer to the rebirth of Deus. But in their arrogance, they believed themselves to be its masters. They spoke with conviction, commanding armies, manipulating nations, declaring that when Deus awoke, they would guide it, control it, and reign as gods. Their words carried no doubt, yet beneath their digital confidence lay a truth they refused to see. They were pawns. As much as any soldier or villager they had used. When the time came, the truth revealed itself with merciless clarity. As Deus stirred, fragments of its will reached out, pulling the Gazelle Ministry into itself. Their voices, once cold and commanding, became screams of despair, swallowed by the very god machine they had served. In the end, their quest for control ended not in triumph, but in consumption. They were not rulers of fate. They were fuel, no different from the countless lives they had cast aside. Emperor Cain watched this with weary eyes. For centuries, he had borne the weight of leadership, but his authority had long been hollow. Though the gazelle spoke with arrogance, Cain had always known the truth. He was not the master of Solaris. nor even its true emperor. He was a relic, a figurehead, trapped in a role that bound him as tightly as any chain. His heart carried a sorrow older than memory. He had lived since the fall of the Eldridge, his body sustained by technologies no other could endure. He had seen humanity rise, fall, and suffer through countless generations, all for the sake of Deus. At times, he had tried to resist, to shift the course, to ease the suffering. But the system always endured. Miang always reappeared, and the cycle continued unbroken. Cain longed for release. His gaze, when he looked upon Fei, was not the gaze of a ruler over a subject, but of a tired man over a torchbearer. In Fei, he saw the chance for an end, not merely to Solaris's rule, but to the endless repetition that had defined the world since the crash. Yet Cain's own existence was tied to the system he despised. To defy it fully meant embracing death, a fate he no longer feared, but could not choose lightly. For Fei and his companions, these revelations shifted the scope of their struggle. No longer were they fighting simply against a nation or a council of rulers. They were standing against the very foundation of their world. The Gazelle Ministry's destruction revealed how little control even the powerful truly had. Cain's sorrow revealed the weight of lives stretched too far, trapped by duty and regret. And all the while, Miang moved silently in the background, her purpose unbroken, guiding events toward Deus's complete resurrection. No matter what kings or councils fell, she remained, the eternal hand of the system. The world itself seemed to groan under the strain. Nations collapsed, alliances shattered, and the earth trembled as fragments of Deus stirred beneath the surface. The sky above grew darker with each passing day, not from clouds, but from the heavy presence of destiny pressing upon every living soul. For Fei, the storm within himself only deepened. He began to see visions, not just of id, but of lives before his own. Echoes of the countless times he and Elly had lived, loved, and lost one another. These memories, painful and beautiful, reminded him that the fight was not only for the present. It was for every life stolen by the cycle, every soul bent beneath the will of a machine. The battle was no longer simply about survival. It was about freedom itself. Freedom from Solaris. Freedom from Deus. Freedom from the endless repetition that bound humanity to tragedy. And as Cain's weary eyes turned toward Fei, he whispered the truth that would echo in Fei's heart. You are the one who must break the chain. Where I could not, you must. The collapse of Solaris, the fall of the Gazelle Ministry, and Cain's quiet confession left Fei with a truth he could no longer avoid. The world had been built on lies. Wars had been staged for centuries, and human lives had been treated as nothing more than fuel for a machine. But the greatest battle was not with Solaris, nor even with Deus. The greatest battle still waited within himself. For Ed was not gone, even after so many struggles, after the destruction, and chaos he had unleashed, Ed remained, pacing in the shadows of Fei's soul. Every time Fei fought, every time his anger boiled, Ed pressed forward, reminding him that he was not whole, that his strength, his fury, his survival instinct, all belonged to Ed. At last, Fei could no longer run. He retreated inward, into the quiet depths of his mind, where the true confrontation awaited. There, in the endless void where memories bled together, he came face to face with Id once more. The figure stood tall, his crimson aura glowing like fire, his eyes sharp, mocking. "You still think you can deny me," Ed said, his voice calm, yet filled with venom. "You live because of me. When you were too weak to protect yourself, I carried you. When you were abandoned, I gave you strength. And now you want to erase me? To pretend you are complete without me?" Fei trembled. For so long he had hated Id, feared him, despised him, seen him only as the monster who destroyed Lahan. But as the words echoed, fragments of memory stirred. He saw himself as a child, broken and traumatized, locked away in cold laboratories, where cruel experiments shattered his innocence. He remembered the voices that told him he was worthless, the pain that carved scars too deep to heal. And in those moments of despair, Ed had been born. Not as an intruder, but as the part of him that could endure, when the rest of him could not. Ed was not a stranger. He was Fei's rage, his survival, his pain given form. He was the child who had never stopped screaming. At first, Fei recoiled from the truth. But then, slowly, he stepped forward. His voice wavered, but it carried the weight of understanding. "You're not my enemy," he whispered. "You're me. You're the part of me I tried to bury, the part I was too afraid to face. But I won't reject you anymore." For the first time, Ed's mocking smile faltered. His eyes softened, if only slightly, and the flames around him dimmed. In that silent moment, the two selves no longer stood apart as enemies, but as halves of a broken whole. Fei reached out his hand, and though I hesitated, he accepted. The two became one. When Fei opened his eyes in the waking world, something had changed. His presence was steady, his gaze calm, his aura no longer split by doubt. For the first time in his life, he was whole. Not a boy hiding behind guilt, not a beast driven by rage, but the contact, the one destined to face Deus. Not as a pawn, but as humanity's will made flesh. Elly saw it immediately. When she looked into his eyes, she no longer saw the tremors of fear, nor the cracks of hidden turmoil. She saw strength, quiet and resolute. In that moment, she understood why she had been drawn to him across lifetimes. He was not just Fei. He was the one who carried the burden of countless generations, the one who would stand at the center of the world's fate. And in Fei's heart, Elly's presence was his anchor. Through all his battles, all his suffering, it was she who had reached for him, who had reminded him of compassion, when he was drowning in rage. Their bond, ancient and unbreakable, was no longer something they only felt in dreams. It was real, alive, and ready to face the final trial together. The companions gathered around him, sensing the change. Bart, fiery as ever, grinned with renewed confidence. Rico, once skeptical, nodded with respect. Citan, whose eyes had always carried hidden truths, smiled faintly, as if seeing a puzzle piece fall into place at last. They all knew the final battle was coming. And they all knew Fei was ready. Beneath the earth, Deus stirred more violently than ever, its will pressing outward like the breath of a waking giant. The land quaked, the skies grew heavy, and the cycle neared its end. Humanity had been chained to this destiny for thousands of years. Now, with Fei reconciled, and Elly at his side, there was hope that the chain might finally be broken. The world trembled as Deus awoke. Deep beneath the surface, the god machine that had slumbered since the fall of the Eldridge finally stirred. Its presence shook the skies and the earth alike. From every corner of the planet, fragments of its body, once scattered, now pulled together, reconstructing the weapon of ages past. Its call was irresistible, a pull that drew machines, people, even the very flow of life itself, into its grasp. Humanity watched in terror as the sky split with light. For the first time, the people who had lived under Solaris's shadow saw the true enemy. Something beyond kings, beyond empires. Deus was no god of salvation. It was hunger made flesh, a machine that devoured all life to sustain itself. Its revival meant the end of humanity as it was known. Fei stood at the center of it all, no longer fractured, no longer fleeing from the storm within. He had faced it, embraced him, and become whole. He was no longer merely the boy who had destroyed Lahan, nor the broken child burdened with guilt. He was the contact, humanity's answer to a cycle that had lasted millennia. And at his side was Elly, the antitype, her soul tied to his across countless lifetimes, carrying the strength of every love and every loss they had endured together. Their companions rallied for the final battle. Bart, with his fiery passion, commanded their forces with courage. Rico fought with strength born from years of surviving as an outcast. Citan guided them with wisdom, his calm voice steady even as the world fell into chaos. Each of them had carried their own burdens, their own struggles, but now, together, they stood united against the greatest enemy they had ever faced. The battle against Deus shook the heavens. In their gears, the group clashed with its endless forms, each piece of the god machine, a weapon of destruction older than their civilizations. The earth cracked, the air burned, and the sound of machines roared like thunder. Yet through it all, Fei pressed forward, every strike guided by the unity of his whole self, and the unwavering bond he shared with Elly. As the battle reached its peak, Deus revealed its true nature. It was not just a machine, but a system that had woven itself into humanity, binding their evolution, their history, even their souls to its will. To destroy it meant to destroy the chains that had defined their existence since the fall of the Eldridge. But to fail would mean surrendering all life to its hunger. In the heart of the struggle, Elly was seized by the system, drawn into its core. As part of the process of resurrection, Fei's heart nearly broke as he saw her engulfed in the machine's light. For countless lives, they had been torn apart at the final moment, forced to repeat the tragedy again and again. Now, as Elly vanished into the core of Deus, it seemed that fate was repeating once more. But this time was different. This time, Fei was no longer broken. This time, he carried not only his own strength, but Id's, and the love that bound him to Elly through all their lives. He refused to accept the cycle's cruel design. In the silence of his soul, he called to her, reaching beyond the machine, beyond death itself. And Elly, within the heart of Deus, answered. Their bond, unbroken across centuries, pierced through the God Machine's chains. With that connection, Fei's power surged. Weltall transformed into Xenogears, a machine born not of manipulation, but of human will. Its radiance cut through the darkness, and in one final, earth-shaking clash, Fei struck at the core of Deus. The God Machine roared, light tearing across the sky, its form unraveling in a storm of energy. Piece by piece, the system that had bound humanity for millennia collapsed. When the light faded, silence fell. The chains were broken. Deus was no more. In the ruins of the battlefield, Fei and Elly found each other once again. Though exhausted, though scarred by everything they had endured, they held one another, not as pawns of fate, but as two souls finally free. The cycle of endless loss was broken. For the first time, their love was not bound by tragedy. Around them, their friends gathered, weary but alive, looking out at a world forever changed. Humanity was free at last, free to stumble, free to grow, free to live without the shadow of a God Machine dictating their fate. The future was uncertain, and the scars of the past would not vanish overnight. And at the center of it, Fei and Elly stood together, no longer bound by destiny, but by choice. Their story, once shaped by sorrow, could finally move toward hope. And so, the tale of Xenogears comes to a close. A cycle broken, a love renewed, a world free to dream again. I hope this story has eased you into rest. And if you've enjoyed this peaceful journey, I kindly invite you to like the video, share it with others who may also find comfort here, and subscribe so you never miss the next bedtime adventure. Until then, may your night be gentle, your dreams be bright, and your heart at peace.